This happened last year when I was single. I'm a 27-year-old woman, but I was 26 at the time. I had just downloaded the dating app Tinder, but I was just trying it out. I didn't have any intention to actually meet somebody at the time. I would open it once a day and read a few profiles. By read, I mean look at pictures, because hardly anybody actually writes anything. I didn't actually match with anyone, because I didn't swipe right one single time. I was just there to observe. There was one guy who seemed to pop up almost every time I signed in. His name was Joe, and he was a clean-cut guy, a little overweight, and probably 6 feet tall if I had to guess. I think Tinder has a paid feature where they will show your profile repeatedly, so maybe he had that. It didn't matter to me though. I just kept swiping left to say not interested. One time, I was out walking my dog in a park near my apartment, and I saw a guy walking towards me on the gravel path. As he got closer, he nodded politely, and I did the same. Something about the guy seemed familiar. It took me a few minutes of thinking, but eventually, I realized that it was Joe from Tinder. Not a big deal, I thought. We do live in a big city, so the chances of running into him were small, but not unbelievable. Over the next few weeks, I seemed to run into Joe a few too many times, and it became creepy. I began to suspect that I might have a stalker. One evening, I was in my room getting ready for bed when I looked out my window and saw a pair of eyes looking back at me. Someone was looking in through my window. My apartment was on the 2nd floor, so it would have taken some effort to climb up there. As soon as we made eye contact, he disappeared. I went over to the window and looked out. I saw a man running away. I could only see him from behind, but I'm pretty sure that it was Joe. I called the police immediately. They suggested that I stay with a friend for the night, which I did. The next day, we went to the police station to file a report. I actually didn't have any way to contact Joe, since we never met online or otherwise. What we ended up doing was actually pretty creative. When I was discussing with the investigator, I opened the Tinder app and simply swiped until Joe's profile came up. When it did, I told them that that was him. The police placed a restraining order on Joe, and I'm glad to say that we've not crossed paths since. I'm a 23-year-old woman, and I started using the dating app Hinge a while ago. I had tried a few of the other apps with little success, but I heard from a friend that this one was supposed to be better. I took her word for it and set up a profile. It wasn't long before I started getting matches. One of my matches was Chris. He was a year older than me, with brown hair and kind of an artistic-looking style. Thick glasses with a beard. We had a pretty good conversation one night, and because of that, we decided to meet up in real life. There was a bar that I'd been to a few times with friends, and we agreed to go there. It wasn't my main spot. You should never bring online dates to your favorite places, just in case. I was a little late, so when I got there, Chris was standing at the front waiting. We went in and actually had a pretty good time. Chris was a little socially awkward, but it wasn't that bad. I actually found him kind of cute. We had a few drinks and talked for about 2 hours. Then we went our separate ways, and I headed home. Over the next few weeks, Chris would text me sporadically. I would say once every 2 or 3 days on average. He would go hours or even days without replying, and that's a big red flag for me, so I eventually just stopped answering him. I figured he wasn't ready for someone like me. No hard feelings, I thought. Fast forward to a few weeks later, and I was at home bored when I got a notification on my phone. It was Chris. I was surprised to hear from him, but slightly in a positive way. He asked me if I wanted to hang out that night, and like I said, I was bored, so I agreed. This time I gave him my address so he could pick me up. Half an hour later, he pulled up in front of my building. He had a blue Honda Civic with a large dent in the rear bumper. I got in, and as soon as I did, the mood felt off. Like I mentioned before, he was kind of an awkward guy, but this time, he hardly said a word. I immediately regretted my decision to get into a car with this guy. I decided that as soon as we stopped, I would make an excuse and get out of there. We were going to a different bar this time, and as soon as Chris parked the car, I faked an important call and said I had to leave. I could tell by the look on his face that he didn't believe me, but I turned around and walked away, and he didn't try to stop me. When I was on the bus, I blocked and deleted Chris from Hinge, and blocked his number on my phone as well. He didn't do anything that bad, just gave me a weird feeling. It's hard to explain, it just felt off. However, if that was the end of it, then this wouldn't be a very scary story. Over the coming days, Chris sent me a friend request on Facebook and also followed me on Instagram. I was starting to feel creeped out, so I blocked him on both apps. A few days went by and nothing really happened. However, eventually, I started seeing some things that really scared me. I started to see his car parked on the street near my work and even near my apartment building. The dent in the bumper was a dead giveaway. It started to seem like he was stalking me. A few weeks went by, and I kept seeing the car now and then, but I never saw Chris. However, that would eventually change. One evening, I was coming home late from work. I was walking down the sidewalk. It was dark, and for reasons I can't explain, a chill ran down my spine. That was when I looked across the street and saw Chris's car. It was a very quiet night. The street was almost completely empty, so I was feeling very vulnerable. Just then, I was grabbed from behind. A man's arm was wrapped around me. It was Chris. We struggled for what seemed like a long time, but it was probably only a few seconds. It was soon obvious that I could not overpower him, so I did the one thing that I could think to do. I screamed. I screamed as loud as I could, and I didn't stop. Eventually, the noise must have been enough to draw some attention to us, because a few people came out onto the street from one of the nearby apartment buildings. As soon as that happened, Chris took off. I called the police that night and told them the whole story. Fortunately, I wrote down Chris's license plate number, so it was not difficult to track him down. Legal charges are still pending against him for what he did, but I was given a restraining order pretty much overnight. There were many warning signs for what eventually happened. Looking back, I feel that I should have called the police as soon as I started seeing his car parked in my neighborhood. Signs like that should never be ignored, and I almost paid a horrible price because of it. I'm Ryan, and I'm a 26-year-old guy, but this happened a few years ago when I was 25. I had been using online dating apps for about 6 months at the time. Like most people, I was skeptical at first. My biggest fear was that I would go to meet a girl, and it would end up being some group of guys playing a prank. So my biggest fear was humiliation. This story, however, is not about humiliation. What happened to me was much worse. I matched with a girl named Katie on the dating app Bumble. She was my age with blonde hair and a few tattoos, which was just my type. After we sent a few messages back and forth, I asked her to meet in real life. She agreed and I sent her my number. Normally, I like to take our communication off the app as soon as possible, since it feels a little more personal when you have a person's number. However, she didn't text me and continued using Bumble's Messenger. I figured she just wanted to make sure I was real before giving out any personal information. I respected that and didn't push the issue. You can't be too careful. Katie suggested that we meet at a small bar in the downtown area. It was walking distance from my apartment, so it was perfect for me. I set out on foot and arrived about 10 minutes early. When I got to the bar, I noticed that it was closed. It was a Tuesday evening, so not exactly the busiest time for bars. I opened the app and sent Katie a message saying that I was there and that the bar was closed. She replied and suggested another place down the street from this one. She also told me that there was a shortcut through a park. I agreed to go to the other place and started walking. While I made my way down the sidewalk, I checked my messages to see if there was any update from Katie. I had a message from her saying that she was there waiting and that I should hurry and cut through the park. I agreed and started walking faster. It was 8 p.m. and the sun was down, so when I got to the park, it was almost pitch dark. The small path going through was unlit. Therefore, I didn't really feel comfortable walking through there. Instead, I started jogging on the sidewalk so I wouldn't leave my date waiting more than I needed to. When I made it to the bar, I was exhausted from running. I stood outside for a minute on the sidewalk before going in so I could cool down and catch my breath. I took this time to check my messages again, but when I looked at Bumble, I was shocked to see that Katie had blocked me. I stared at my phone, still breathing heavily. I was confused. Why would she delete me right before our date? Once I was ready, I went into the bar. I figured it was a mistake, so I could just find her, and then we would exchange information if things went well. I went in and walked around the bar for a few minutes, but Katie was nowhere to be found. The place was small, and she definitely was not there. That was when I started to connect the dots. She was leading me into a trap. She had most likely suggested the first place because she knew it would be closed. Then she could lead me into the park, which was on the way to this place. I figured there was some kind of ambush waiting for me. Luckily, when I got there, I knew it didn't feel right, although at the time, I wasn't sure why. She must have deleted me when she realized that the plan had failed. Although I was disappointed and definitely creeped out by this incident, I realized that it could have turned out a lot worse. Whenever you meet people online, always make sure to follow your intuition and don't do anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. Although I still believe that most people are good, there are some out there who mean to do you harm. Just for some background, I'm an 18-year-old male currently living in New York. I'm 6'4" and muscular. I've always been one of the larger kids in my class, and I look old for my age. I stopped growing in 9th grade, which was 4 years ago, so that should give you an idea of what I mean. I was that kid in the 8th grade who could already grow a full beard. There's one of us in every school. This happened last month just after my 18th birthday. I was lonely after a breakup with my girlfriend of 7 months, and I was looking for a rebound, so I turned to Tinder. I set up a profile with my real pictures and lied about my age, saying I was 24. I matched with a gorgeous girl. She was almost too good to be true, but I went with it anyway. We exchanged a few innocent messages and planned to meet at her place the next day at 9 p.m. I wasn't as excited as you might think. I had my doubts about whether she was real or not. The next day, as the time approached 9 p.m., I was getting ready to go over to her place. Before I left, I texted my dad saying that I was going to a friend's house. I asked my good friend James, who was 6 years my senior, to drive me, since I didn't have a car. He drove me to her apartment, and I rang the doorbell. I heard light footsteps behind the door, and a high-pitched voice saying, "Be right there." That's when I texted James telling him that everything was fine, and that he could leave. As soon as the door opened, I felt a tremendous sense of relief, because I was face to face with the girl from the pictures. Unfortunately, that feeling would be short-lived. As soon as I entered, she promptly asked me if I wanted a drink. I politely declined, which caused a noticeable change in her demeanor. This set off a red flag, and I became suspicious of her intentions. Realizing that I might be in trouble, I asked to use the bathroom to give me a chance to contact my friend. She obliged eagerly. I entered the bathroom and quickly texted James for a ride. Looking up from my phone, I could barely make out what looked like a dark figure behind the shower curtain. Before I was sure what I was seeing, the figure pounced out like a cat, and I found myself in a wrestling match with this mysterious man. I was absolutely terrified, even though I was much larger than him. He was probably 5'10", 165 pounds, and bald. He seemed to be in his mid-30s. I was 6'4" and 210 pounds. Once I got my wits about me, I was able to overpower him easily. I took him to the ground and punched him in the face 2 or 3 times. After that, James texted me to tell me that he was waiting outside the building. Just then, the girl barged into the bathroom and started screaming. I ran past her and got out of that apartment. When I got into the car, I frantically explained to him what had happened. It only then hit me that I could have been drugged, mugged, or worse. I took screenshots of her profile and all the messages between us. Even though I'd gathered all that evidence, there was still little that the police could do, since it was just my word against theirs. I got away from this one with little more than a scare, The moral of the story is that you always meet in a public place for a first date. Probably the second too, just to be safe. After my marriage ended, I was in a tough spot financially. I was working part-time as a server, and I had an apartment that I couldn't afford. It wasn't fancy or anything, but I didn't make enough to keep up with the rent anyway. I started using Tinder to meet new people around that time. I had used it in the past. In fact, that's how I met my first husband. I was at home swiping on the app one evening, and nobody really caught my eye. Maybe I was being too picky, or maybe I wasn't over my ex yet. After a while, though, an interesting profile came up. His name was Jay, and he was actually a few years younger than me. Normally, I'm interested in older guys. Not too much older, but I'd never dated anyone younger before. I cycled through each of his pictures a few times. They showed him in different locations. One was a white sand beach, another was in New York City. There was even one image of Jay where it looked like he was in front of a private jet. I know I sound shallow, but that's the truth about what made him stand out. That wasn't the only reason I was interested. It was just what made him stand out initially. I swiped right on Jay, which was the only right swipe I had done so far. Then I put my phone away and went to bed. When I woke up the next morning, I opened my phone and saw that I had a match on Tinder. I knew it was Jay because that's the only one I had accepted. I opened my messages and saw that he had contacted me already. All he said was hi. That's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. If you're going to contact me, then try to say a little more than that. I let it slide this time though, and we started to have a conversation. After no more than 5 or 10 messages each way, Jay asked me out on a date. I accepted, and we made plans for the following Friday night. We went out to a really nice restaurant, way fancier than what I would have suggested. He was a slightly awkward guy. I can't really put my finger on why. We had an alright conversation, but there were more uncomfortable silences than I'm used to. It was a first date though, and first dates can be awkward. When the bill came, I was a little nervous that Jay would want to split the cost for the night. I didn't know how much it would be, but I knew that I couldn't afford it. That's why I was relieved when Jay grabbed the bill from the table without hesitation. After that, we parted ways, and I headed home on the bus. Jay and I went out another few times over the following weeks. Like before, we always had a pretty good time. There was something off about him though. It was like he was trying too hard to impress me. It was clear that he had money, and he wasn't afraid to spend it on me. Things were getting more and more extravagant. He took me on a river cruise on the weekend that must have been at least a few $1,000s total. All that for a woman who wasn't even his girlfriend yet. I don't mean to sound unappreciative, but it did seem like a bit of a red flag. Things came to a head when Jay texted me and invited me on a trip to Mexico. Although tempting, I wasn't ready to make that kind of step. I felt bad, but I broke things off with him through text message. After that, my phone rang. It was Jay. I answered it and was immediately bombarded with the most vile, hate-filled insults I'd ever heard. This guy was mad. I'd never seen this side of him before. While we were dating, Jay was a really polite and shy type of guy. I held the phone up to my ear for a minute or two, and the screaming didn't stop, so I eventually hung up the phone and turned it off. I was scared. I didn't know what this guy was capable of. He also knew where I lived because he'd dropped me off at my apartment once or twice before. The next morning, I turned on my phone, and there were dozens of missed calls and tons of messages from Jay. I don't remember the exact content of the messages, but they were filled with the same insults as before. I didn't reply for the next few days, but eventually, I decided to call him and try to smooth things over. He picked up the phone and started screaming at me like before. I tried to calm him down for a minute or so, but it was useless. He even said that I had to pay him back for all the dates we'd been on. I was in no position financially to do that, so I hung up again. I went to work the next night. I was working nights as a server at the time, and my mind was on Jay the whole evening. I was worried that he'd come for me for the money, or worse. I got off at around 1 a.m. and took the bus home. When I got to my front door, my heart sank. The door was wide open. I took a cautious step inside, and as soon as I did, I knew someone had been there. My mind went immediately to Jay. I called out hello, but there was no response. I walked through the place, fear flowing through my body. When I got to my bedroom, I noticed something on my bed. It was a piece of paper. I picked it up and turned it over. There was a message written on it that said, "You're dead." That was enough. I ran out of there and didn't go back. I went to my friend's place that night and called the police. They were able to arrest Jay with my testimony, as well as the evidence that they were able to gather from my apartment. After the police interrogated Jay, they found out that he was flat broke and that he was paying for our dates with borrowed money on several credit cards. I was really confused about that for a while, but when I saw a documentary on Netflix, it started to make sense. In the documentary, a guy used Tinder to sweep women off their feet with expensive gifts and dates. Then he would trick them into paying him back by borrowing money, and then he would promise to pay them back, but never would. My relationship with Jay never got that far, but I suspect it was leading there. That would explain why he wanted me to pay him back. After that, I never heard from him again, and I'm more careful about who I meet online. This reminds me of an old saying that my grandfather used to use. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is. I worked at a small ice cream shop when I was in my early 20s. That's where I met one of my best friends. Her name was Melanie, and she was 1 year younger than me. I was kind of like a big sister to her. We always tried to have our shifts together, which were usually in the evenings, since the more senior workers got the day shifts. The place had a few busy periods throughout the night, usually when the movie ends. There was a large movie theater nearby, and that was the main source of customers. We would use that time to gossip and discuss our personal lives. I had a steady boyfriend at the time, and we'd been together since high school, so I didn't have any experience with dating apps. Melanie, on the other hand, was on several different apps. She was around 5'8", with short blonde hair and slightly plus-sized. She used Tinder mostly, and would often show me her matches and the cringy openers that they would send her. We were standing behind the counter at the shop, huddled around her phone giggling. She then showed me a new match of hers and the conversation that they'd started. His name was Troy, and he was 27 years old. Troy had longish black hair, a short beard, and glasses. He was actually really good looking, almost like a model. My first impression was that it might be fake, but I didn't want to be a downer, so I kept my mouth shut. Melanie then told me that they were planning to go on their first date the following night. I wished her luck. Then she put away her phone, and we finished our shift for the night. I gave her a call the following night at around 11 p.m. to see how the date went. She didn't answer, which I took as a good sign. Then I went to bed. Melanie and I had a shift together the next night, and I was excited to find out how the date went. When I got to work, though, Melanie was nowhere to be found. It was not like her to be late, so I called her phone, but there was no answer. I didn't have her parents' number, so I really didn't know what to do. I waited at the shop for about half an hour, and then I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police. When I talked to the officer, I found out that Melanie had been reported missing by her mother the night before. She never came back from the date. Several weeks went by, and nobody heard anything from Melanie. I continued to work at the shop, but it was incredibly difficult without her. I couldn't get my mind off of her. I was in close contact with her mother, and I was frustrated with the police, who hadn't made any progress in the case. It had been over 2 weeks and no arrests were made, so I was frustrated. Another week went by, and there was still no word about Melanie. By then, I was beyond frustrated. I had to do something, so I came up with a plan. I set up a profile on Tinder and uploaded some of my cutest photos. I remembered the face of the guy who Melanie went out with that night. I had no idea if the pictures I saw were real, but I had to try. I opened the app and started swiping. I swiped left to pass on each and every profile. I was only concerned with finding the guy who took Melanie out that night. It took an hour or so, but eventually I found what looked like the guy. It said his name was Chad, although I'm pretty sure it was Troy before. I looked through the profile for a minute, and then I swiped right. Once I did that, I put my phone away and tried to take my mind off of it. Later that day, I opened the app, and I saw that I had a message from him. I felt a combination of disgust and excitement. This could be the key to finding out what happened to my friend. I replied to his message, and I'm embarrassed to say that what I typed was very provocative. I needed this guy to be interested. After a few more messages, Chad asked me out on a date, which I accepted eagerly. The next night, we met for drinks at a small bar on the other side of town. I had trouble holding back tears when I saw him sitting at a table in a far corner of the dingy room. He looked just like his pictures, which was actually surprising to me. I sat down and put on my best forced smile, but it almost caused me to dry heave. We talked for about an hour. I didn't bring up Melanie, even though it was big news in the area. As I sat there looking at this guy, I wondered what he knew. He really gave me the creeps, and I strongly suspected that he had something to do with whatever happened to Melanie. I contemplated my next step. The plan was simply to get in touch with the guy, and to be honest, I didn't expect it to work. Now that I was there, I really didn't know what to do. I kept talking to Chad until eventually he asked me to come back to his place. I politely declined, and then I quickly excused myself. I got up and walked out of that place as fast as I could. When I got to the street, I dialed 911. I got a hold of the detective on Melanie's case, and I explained what happened. I told him what I did, and I thought this guy was responsible for Melanie's disappearance. To my relief, the officer believed me and took it seriously. I gave Chad's information to them, and they promised to look into it. A week later, I heard that Chad was arrested and confessed to accidentally killing Melanie. He even led them to her body. I still work at the ice cream shop, but I never fully got over what happened to my friend. There's some closure in learning the truth, but it's still tough. I'm a 36-year-old guy, and this happened to me when I was 30. I had never had much success with women, probably because I'm really shy and introverted. When I was younger, I would try to go out with friends, but I was always really uncomfortable with crowds. Dance clubs are pretty much the last place that I've ever wanted to be. Because of that, it's always been very difficult for me to meet women. I'm not a bad-looking guy. I'm tall and reasonably fit. Since everyone pretty much judges others on their pictures, I felt I had an advantage. I much prefer to be judged on my looks rather than my awkward personality. I was using a dating app called OkCupid, and I was talking to a really beautiful woman named Shelly. She honestly looked like a fashion model or something. I could hardly believe she was interested in me. We talked every night for over 2 weeks, before she finally asked me to meet in real life. I suggested that we meet for dinner at a restaurant, but she invited me over to her place. That alone should have been a big red flag, but I agreed anyway. When the time came, I took the bus to the address that Shelly gave me, and when I got there, it was an older house that desperately needed work. Not exactly the kind of place I was expecting for that kind of woman. I thought it would be some kind of luxury penthouse or something like that. The place was a single story with a double-car garage. It had light blue vinyl siding with several panels missing. The roof was made of brown shingles, and they were all curled up, showing signs that they needed to be replaced. There were no lights on the house, so I was unsure whether I was in the right place. I sent a text to Shelly to make sure it was really her house. She replied right away and told me to go in through the garage. I looked over to the garage. The large door was slightly open at the bottom. There was a 3 or 4 foot opening, just enough for me to squeeze through without getting on my hands and knees. I was apprehensive, but I was really excited to meet this girl, so I walked up the driveway towards the open garage door. I stood in front of it, then I leaned down and looked in. There was one dim light in the far corner of the garage. I also noticed that there was no car. I bent down and squeezed through the gap, then I stood up and looked around. I saw a masked man standing across the room, and he was holding a knife. As soon as we locked eyes, the door started to slide down, and the man ran at me. I dropped to the ground and rolled back out of the garage, missing the automatic door by a few inches. I sprung up to my feet and ran out of there. When I was a few blocks away, there was a Dunkin' Donuts that was quite busy. When I saw the busy store, I knew I was safe. Once I had a chance to catch my breath, I decided not to go to the police. To be honest, I was really embarrassed to have fallen for that trick, and I was embarrassed to be using online dating to begin with. I know it was the wrong move, but that's what I did. About a year later, I was watching the news, and I heard that someone else had had a similar experience to me, only it didn't end as well. I know now that I could have saved somebody's life that night if I'd reported it, but I didn't, and it weighs heavily on my conscience to this day. I had managed to avoid using dating apps for a long time, but I was having a hard time finding a decent guy at bars and clubs, so I decided to give it a try. One night, while scrolling through Tinder, I came across a profile that caught my eye. His name was Pat, and he seemed like a real nice guy. We talked for a while and decided to meet up for a drink. I gave him my address, and he said he'd pick me up at around 7. I put on a nice dress and waited nervously for him to arrive. As I stood outside my apartment building, I saw a car pull up. It was a beat-up old truck. I wondered if it was really him. But when it pulled up in front of my building, I knew it was Pat. He was tall, with short blonde hair and a patchy beard. He wore a plaid shirt and jeans, and had a smile that lit up his face. He walked over to me and gave me a big hug. I felt a little awkward, but also a little excited. We got into his truck, and he asked me if I was hungry. I told him I wasn't, but he said that he knew a great place for drinks. It was a little out of our town, but he promised it would be worth it. I hesitated for a moment, but he seemed so charming and persuasive that I eventually agreed. As we drove out of the town, I noticed the scenery changing. Buildings became fewer and farther between, and the trees got thicker. I began to feel a little worried, but I tried to tell myself that it was just my nerves. After all, I had only just met this guy. When we arrived at the bar, I realized it was not the kind of place I was used to. It was small and dingy, and it smelled of stale beer. There were only a few other people there, and they all turned to look at us when we walked in. I felt even more out of place. Pat ordered us drinks, and tried to get me a shot, but I declined. He kept insisting though, and I eventually gave in. I thought it might make me relax a little. As we sat there talking, all Pat seemed to do was brag about himself. He talked about all the fights that he'd been in, and that he once saved a kid from drowning. I tried to listen and nod along, but I really thought he was full of it. I didn't think he was really the kind of guy I wanted to be with. As the night wore on, I started to feel more and more scared. There was no cell service, and I was in the middle of nowhere with a guy I barely knew. Pat kept trying to get me to drink more, but I started to feel sick. I told him I wanted to leave, but he wouldn't take me. He said that we were having a good time and that I shouldn't spoil it, but I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I made up an excuse and said that I needed to get home. I told him I had an early morning meeting and needed to get some rest. He seemed reluctant, but finally agreed to take me back to my apartment. As we drove back, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, but then Pat started to get angry. He said that I was wasting his time and that he'd driven me all the way there for nothing. I felt my heart racing as he pulled over to the side of the road. He turned to me and said,
"Just get out then. I'm not taking you any further."
I got out of the truck and started walking down the road. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from him. I heard him yelling at me as he drove away, but I didn't respond. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. I just kept walking. As I walked, I felt the cold night air on my skin. I was shivering, and my feet were starting to hurt. I realized I had no idea where I was, and I didn't have any way to call for help. My phone still wasn't working. I felt like I was in a nightmare. I couldn't believe I'd been so foolish to trust this guy. I felt like I put myself in danger, and I didn't know how to get out of it. After walking for almost an hour, I saw a car approaching. I stuck out my thumb and prayed that they would stop. The car slowed down, and I saw an older couple inside. They asked me if I needed a ride, and I almost started crying with relief. They took me to the nearest town and dropped me off at a gas station. I went inside and called a friend to come pick me up. I didn't tell her the whole story, but I told her enough so that she would know that I really needed help. When I got home, I collapsed onto my bed and cried. I couldn't believe what happened. I felt like I'd been so stupid to trust a stranger. After that night, I never spoke to Pat again. I deleted his number and blocked him. It took me a while to get over that experience, but I eventually did. I learned from it, and I grew from it. I promised myself I would never put myself in that kind of situation again. Now whenever I go on a date, I'm more cautious. I make sure to meet up in a public place where there are lots of other people. I also realized that I told Pat my address before we even met. I live in a large apartment building, so it would be difficult for him to find me, but that was also a mistake that I won't make again. I started using Tinder a while ago, and it's been okay. I'd always wanted to meet somebody the old-fashioned way, but my work schedule was really busy, so I finally decided to give it a try. It was around the year 2015, so Tinder was fairly new at the time. After I set my profile up, I started swiping. I was surprised by how many matches I got. It was actually only 3 or 4, but that's still more than I was expecting. One of them was Tanya. She was absolutely gorgeous, with long curly hair. We hit it off right away, and after a few days of chatting, we agreed to meet at a park near my apartment. On the day of our date, I arrived at the park early. It was a nice day. The sun was shining and a gentle breeze was blowing through the trees. The park was quiet, with just a few families and couples scattered around. I found a bench near the spot where we were going to meet. As the minutes ticked by, I became anxious. It was past the time that we agreed on. I checked my phone every few seconds, wondering if she had canceled or gotten lost. As the sun began to set, I started to worry that I'd been stood up. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. A long shadow appeared, cast by the late day sun. I turned to see 3 guys approaching me. They were all around 25 years old, and 2 of them were really large. I felt nervous as they got closer, and tried to brace myself for what was about to happen.
Hey man, how's it going?
One of the guys said. Fine, I replied.
Can you spare a few bucks?
Another of them asked. Sorry, I don't have any change, I told him. I stood up to walk away, but 2 of the guys blocked me. Then one of them said,
Can I see your wallet?
I took a step back, trying to put some distance between us. I don't want any trouble, I said, starting to realize what was happening. I tried to squeeze past them again, but they didn't back down. Instead, they moved closer, and one of them grabbed me by the arm. I tried to pull away, but his grip was like a vice. The other 2 guys circled around me, and they looked really intimidating. I knew I had to act fast. Fueled by adrenaline, I swung my free arm and managed to connect with one of the guys. He stumbled back, clutching his nose, and the other 2 guys paused for a moment. I caught them by surprise. That's when I made a run for it. I darted away from them as fast as I could. I looked back every few steps. I could see them chasing me, but I was clearly the faster runner. I just kept going. When I finally stopped, panting and grasping for air, I realized I had no idea where I was. I was in a part of the city that I'd never been before, with no landmarks to guide me. I checked my phone to figure out where I was and how to get back to my apartment. I looked up a map and finally found my bearings. I called an Uber because I didn't want to risk walking home and having those guys find me. I was really embarrassed about what happened, and I tried to play it off like it was nothing. It wasn't until I got home that I started crying. After I had the chance to calm down, I checked my phone. By then, I was pretty sure that Tanya wasn't real. I figured those guys made a fake profile to lure me into a trap. It wasn't the smartest scam, really, because I actually only had $20 or $30 in cash, and they didn't even get that. When I opened the Tinder app, I was surprised to see a new message from Tanya. It said something like this: "Hey, sorry I missed you. I had a family emergency, and I had to take my dad to the hospital." At first, I didn't know what to think. Was this a genuine message, or was she trying to throw me off? Maybe that guy was mad I punched him, and he wanted revenge. I decided to reply, just to see what she would say. I asked her what happened. Tanya replied a few minutes later. "It's a long story. My dad had a heart attack and had to go to the hospital. It was really intense. I don't know what to tell you," she said. I didn't believe it for 1 second. There was no way that it was anyone but those 3 men. I didn't call her out directly, on the off chance that it was real. I simply unmatched her and moved on with my life. I was way too embarrassed to call the police. I didn't know how they could find those guys anyway, because I didn't have any real information for them. That was pretty much the end of it. However, a few months later, I was walking down the street near my place, and I'm pretty sure I saw one of those guys step off the bus. He didn't notice me. It was pretty creepy to think that those guys are out there. I keep thinking of how awkward it would be if I ran into one of them at the grocery store or the gym. It hasn't happened yet, but I'll send an update if anything happens. I've been using Tinder on and off for a few years. I'd used other dating apps as well, but Tinder was really popular when I moved to Denver. I remember the first time I saw his profile. His pictures were intriguing, and his bio was witty. I swiped right and then put my phone away for the night. The next time I opened it, I saw that we matched. We started chatting right away, and I found him to be charming, funny, and intelligent. We talked about our interests, our jobs, and our families, and we clicked almost instantly. We decided to meet up at a coffee shop in the city. I remember being nervous, wondering if he'd be as great in person as he was online. But as soon as I saw him, all my worries melted away. He was tall and handsome, with a warm smile. I think he looked even better than his pictures. We hugged and chatted, sipped our coffees, and laughed about silly things that didn't even matter. The conversation flowed easily, and I felt like I had known him for years. After that first date, we started seeing each other more and more often. We went to restaurants, museums, parks, and just walked around the city. We talked about our hopes and dreams, our fears and doubts, and our plans for the future. I felt like I had found someone who really understood me, someone who made me feel loved. But then things started to change. He would text me constantly, even when I was at work or with friends. He would get upset if I didn't reply right away, and accuse me of ignoring him. He would show up at my apartment unannounced, wanting to hang out, even when I had other plans. At first I thought it was just a sign of his affection, a way of showing me how much he cared, but as time went on, it became really overbearing. I tried talking to him about it, but he would just get really defensive and angry. He would say things like that I was the only person he has in the world, and that he can't live without me. He would accuse me of flirting with other guys, and not really loving him. None of that was even remotely true. It was like he was living in a different reality, one where I was the only source of his happiness and meaning in his life. It started to feel suffocating, like I was always walking on eggshells around him. I couldn't be by myself anymore. I couldn't talk to my friends, or do the things that I enjoyed without feeling guilty or anxious. I started to dread his calls and texts, wondering what new demand or accusation would be waiting for me. It was exhausting. And then one day, he showed up at my work. He came in looking for me, and when I tried to tell him to leave, he started shouting and causing a scene. My coworkers had to call security to get him out. It was really embarrassing. Luckily, my boss was super understanding. I wouldn't have blamed him if he fired me over it, but he just told me to take a break and cool down. Then nobody at work ever brought it up again. I love my coworkers. After that incident, I knew I had to end things with him. I tried to do it gently over the phone, but he wouldn't accept it. Begged me to give him another chance, and promised he would change, that he would never do anything like that again. But I knew deep down that things wouldn't get better. I needed to get away from him before things got worse. Then, he started sending even more messages. At first they were just pleading, desperate messages telling me how much he loved me and that he needed me. But then they turned into threats, angry messages accusing me of leading him on or betraying him. He would send me pictures of me and my friends taken from social media and say things like, "I know where you are, and I'm watching you." He would show up at places that he knew I'd be, just trying to catch a glimpse of me. I was scared, and I didn't know what to do. I tried blocking his number, but he would just create new ones. I changed my social media settings to make them private, but he still found ways to see my posts. Even when I went to the police, they said there wasn't much they could do unless he actually hurt me. Crazy, I know. Then one night, I was home alone watching TV when I heard a noise from outside my apartment. I went to the window and saw him standing there, staring at me. I panicked and locked all the doors and windows, then called the police. He started pounding on the door, trying to open it. I could hear him trying to break down the door, but it was too strong. When the police arrived, he was arrested. He spent the night in jail, and I found out that he was really drunk at the time. He was released the next day. I was eventually granted a restraining order because of that incident. After that, things got a lot better. I never found out exactly what made the difference. Maybe it was the fear of legal consequences, or maybe his friends and family stepped in to help. Whatever it was, I'm thankful that things didn't escalate any further. It's been 2 years now, and I'm still afraid that I'll run into him somewhere. If that happens, I'm not sure what I'll do. As I stepped off the plane at JFK, I felt a rush of excitement mixed with nervousness. I'd never been to New York City before, but I was there for a work conference. In the days leading up to my trip, I had downloaded the Tinder app and swiped through countless profiles until I found a match. Her name was Tracy, and she was a student at NYU. We hit it off immediately, and quickly made plans to meet up. She suggested that we watch the sun set in Central Park, and I agreed. I was really happy to have a local to hang out with, because I wouldn't have known what the good things were to do. As I made my way to the park, I felt a sense of awe at the towering skyscrapers and bustling streets. The noise and energy of the city was like nothing I'd ever experienced before, but as I entered the park, the chaos of the city fell away and was replaced by peaceful sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. I spotted Tracy sitting on a bench near the lake. Her long brown hair blew in the wind. As I approached her, she looked up and smiled. I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through my body. We spent the next hour watching the sunset, talking and laughing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we decided to walk around the park. We strolled through the winding path, marveling at the scenery. It reminded me of every romantic comedy movie I had ever seen. The night was cool and quiet, and the park seemed almost magical. As we walked, we talked about everything and nothing. Our conversation was flowing. We stopped to take some pictures, and as I held my phone up, I saw a man approaching us. Before I could react, he walked up to us brandishing a gun.
"Give me your wallets and your phones,"
he said, his voice gruff and threatening. Tracy and I froze and started shaking. I wanted to run, but I knew I couldn't. I could feel cold sweat beating on my forehead. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. My hand was still shaking. Tracy did the same. Her eyes were wide with fear. The man took our wallets and phones and then fled into the night, leaving us standing there, alone and terrified. We stood there for a few minutes, too shocked and scared to move. Eventually, we made our way back to the hotel, both of us shaken and traumatized. We called the police right then. The next few days were a blur of police reports and canceled credit cards. I reported my phone stolen which is supposed to render it useless to thieves. They probably have a way around that though, but I did it anyway. It was a really horrible experience, and I wasn't sure if I ever wanted to return to New York City again. I'd never been mugged before. It's not that common where I come from. Tracy and I kept in touch over the next few weeks, talking on the phone and texting each other. I haven't been back since, and it's been over a year. Tracy and I haven't talked in a while, and I'm sure she's moved on. I don't know if this is the scariest experience of all time. Some of you have probably been through worse, but it was really scary for me. I met a guy on Tinder a few years ago, probably closer to 5 years ago, and it was actually the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me. We had been chatting for a few days when he asked me out on a date. I agreed, but I was nervous. I'm always very cautious when meeting new people. I made sure to meet in a public place, a busy coffee shop in the middle of the city. I took the bus there because I didn't have a car back then. It was about a half-hour bus ride for me, and I got there about 10 minutes early. I stood out front waiting. After a minute or two, James approached me. When I saw him for the first time, I was relieved. He was tall with broad shoulders, and he looked exactly like his pictures, maybe even a little better. We hit it off right away. We talked for 2 hours, and I found myself laughing and having a great time. We must have lost track of time, and the coffee shop closed. When we left, James offered to drive me home. I hesitated for a moment, but I accepted because I felt like I knew him. We had really been hitting it off, and I was feeling comfortable. I got into his car, and we started driving. We chatted the whole way. I was still having a really good time. I let my guard down, and that's when everything went wrong. We were driving down a busy street when I saw the flashing lights of a police car behind us. James cursed under his breath and started to speed up. I panicked. Why was he running from the police, I thought. I yelled for him to stop, but he ignored me, and the police car continued to chase us. I could hear the sirens getting louder, and I knew we were in trouble. James took a sharp turn, and the car skidded on the pavement. We crashed into a fence, and the car came to a stop. I was really scared, because I had never been in a car crash before. I didn't think I was hurt, but I wasn't sure. Seconds later, I saw 2 police officers with their guns drawn, pointed at us. James was trying to get out of the car, but the officers shouted for him to stay inside. I was shaking with fear and crying. What had I got myself into? The police officers handcuffed us and put us into separate cars. I could see James talking to one of the officers, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. After another few minutes, the officers came to me and told me that James was a wanted criminal. He had been on the run, and the car we were driving was stolen. I couldn't believe it. I had been on a date with a criminal. I felt sick to my stomach, and I wanted to go home. The officers took me to the station to basically repeat my side of the story again. After we were done, they called a cab to take me back to my apartment. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the events of that evening in my head, trying to make sense of it all. I had trusted James, and he turned out to be a total psycho. I didn't know what to believe anymore. It took me a long time to get over what had happened. It felt like I had been fooled, and I was angry with myself for not seeing the signs. But eventually, I realized that I couldn't blame myself. James had lied to me, and he'd put me in danger. I realized I was lucky to have escaped unharmed. It could have been a lot worse. I learned a valuable lesson about trusting strangers, especially those who I meet online. I still use dating apps, but I take my time to get to know someone before meeting them in person, and I don't get into the car with someone who I barely know. I've met many people on dating apps over the years, and there are other stories I could tell, but this one's about someone who I didn't actually meet. I was at home screwing around on my phone, just cycling through the main apps, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally checking my Tinder messages. That's when I noticed a new message. It was from a girl named Cassandra. She was pretty, but not unbelievable like some of those fake model profiles that come up sometimes. I'm pretty good at recognizing crap like that. I replied to her message right away, and we had a pretty decent conversation. Nothing deep or anything, but I could tell she was interested. I didn't waste too much time and asked her out soon after that, and she agreed. She suggested a spot in a neighborhood that I didn't know very well, but I wasn't too picky, so I didn't argue. She sent me the location, and I looked it up on Google Maps. I was a little hesitant because when I saw it, it was in a pretty sketchy part of town, but I didn't want to seem like a wimp, so I didn't say anything. As the day of the date approached, I became more and more nervous. I had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I tried to suggest an alternate location, but she was really insistent on this one. That made me even more suspicious. The spot wasn't the issue anymore. It was really that she was so persistent about it. Finally, I decided that I needed to see her in person before we met. I asked if she would be open to a video chat, and surprisingly, she agreed. I was really expecting her to refuse or ghost me altogether, but she didn't. When the video call connected, I could see her sitting in a dimly lit room, with her face partially obscured by shadows. Her hair was also covering part of her face. She looked up at me and smiled, but something about her was off. When we started talking, I began to notice more and more inconsistencies. She didn't remember anything that we'd talked about on Tinder. She didn't seem to know much about the city we were in either. And worst of all, she didn't look anything like her pictures. In fact, I could barely recognize her. At that point, my suspicions were confirmed. I thought it was a trap of some kind. I don't know what her intentions were, but I knew that I needed to get out of this situation as quickly as possible. I didn't call her out or anything, just made an awkward excuse. She seemed disappointed, but didn't put up much of a fight. I hung up the call, then unmatched and blocked her on Tinder right away. I took a break from online dating for a few weeks after that. Cassandra must have been fake, but I'm still not sure who that woman was in the video call. Maybe a friend of whoever it was that I was talking to. Maybe she was just hired to do it on Fiverr or something. I'm almost certain that I avoided a really bad night, though. I always had trouble meeting girls when I was younger. For some reason, they always saw me as a friend, but nothing more. I did have one relationship when I was in college, but it fizzled out after we graduated. My friends have been bugging me to get back out there, and I figured why not. I could use a little bit of excitement in my life, so I signed up for Plenty of Fish, which was one of the biggest dating sites back then. It was early 2010, February, I think. Online dating was still new, and there was still somewhat of a stigma around it. It was still seen as desperate or pathetic, not like now when everyone does it. I looked around for an hour or so, and then I saw her picture. Her name was Brandy, and she had long black hair, glasses, and a real wholesome look overall. We messaged back and forth for a few days before she suggested that we meet up. I was nervous, but also excited. She seemed like a fun, adventurous person, and I was looking forward to getting to know her. She told me she had a friend visiting from out of town, and suggested that we all get together. I was a little apprehensive about that, but she assured me that her friend was really cool, and it wouldn't be weird. I was really new to dating at the time, so I didn't realize how strange that was. I tend to do better one-on-one, but I was okay with it anyway. We agreed to meet at a bar downtown. As I walked up to the entrance, I saw Brandy waiting. Brandy was even more beautiful in person, with a curvy figure and long dark hair. But there was a man with her. He was over 6 feet tall, with short hair and thick muscular arms. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I approached them. "Hey Chris," Brandy greeted me. "This is my friend Nick." I had assumed that her friend was going to be a girl, so I was surprised to see a guy there. I wouldn't have agreed to the date if I had known that. I didn't have the courage to walk away though, so the three of us entered the bar. We ordered some drinks and sat down at a table. Brandy and Nick chatted about their jobs and their hobbies, while I sat silently, feeling really uncomfortable. I tried to join the conversation, but it was clear they weren't interested in getting to know me, and then things started to get weird. I don't remember much of what happened next, but I know we ordered another round of drinks, and then things started to get fuzzy. My head was spinning, and my vision was blurred. The next thing I knew, I woke up in the back of a car. I tried to scream, but my mouth was covered by duct tape. Panic set in, and I realized what had happened. I had been drugged and kidnapped. I looked up and saw Nick and Brandy in the front seat of the car. They didn't seem to notice that I had woken up. I stayed quiet so they would think I was still asleep. I could hear muffled voices from the front seat, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. After a few minutes, the car finally came to a stop. I could see the glow of a red traffic light. This was my chance. I had to act fast. I unlocked the door and ran into traffic, almost getting hit by a car on my way. I looked back and saw the stunned look on Brandy's face. I must have had high tolerance for whatever drugs they gave me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get out of there as fast as possible. I looked back, and they weren't following me. I guess they didn't want to make a scene. My legs were burning, and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just kept pushing myself, driven by fear and adrenaline, even though I knew I had gotten away. I felt in my pockets, but my wallet and phone were both gone. I kept running, but the area was unfamiliar to me. I looked around trying to get my bearings, but I didn't recognize any of the buildings or streets. I didn't even know what part of town I was in. But I knew one thing for sure. I had to get help. I stumbled down the street trying to flag down passing cars, but no one stopped. Nobody even seemed to notice me. I was stumbling, disheveled and desperate. Eventually, someone stopped and asked if I was all right. She was a woman around my mother's age. I was slurring my words and still feeling really woozy. I figured I just looked like some drunk guy, probably why nobody else would stop to help me. I told her what happened to me earlier, and she called the police. Soon enough, a swarm of police officers and paramedics arrived. It was a blur of activity, a whirlwind of chaos and confusion, but through it all, I felt relieved. I was going to be okay. They took me to the hospital first. I was checked for any injuries or lingering effects from the drugs. I was given a clean bill of health and discharged a few hours later. Then the police took me to the station, where I gave a more detailed statement about what had happened. They told me they would do everything in their power to find the people who kidnapped me and bring them to justice. Unfortunately, I wasn't much help because I didn't have any real information from Brandy and Nick, and in the chaos of it all, I didn't bother to get their license plate, and the phone number Brandy gave me was fake. Despite that, they were eventually caught. It was really big news in my town for a while. Among my community, this incident was a big part of the reason that online dating was frowned upon. Like I said, this was over 10 years ago, and everyone uses it now anyway. I've been married now for over 5 years, and I'm thankful I don't have to meet people online anymore. I started using Tinder in around 2015. I've had some good experiences and some bad. This is about one of the worst things that ever happened to me on any dating app, though. I was about 2 months out of a pretty serious relationship when I created my profile. I'd used Tinder in the past, but I deleted it when I met my ex. I swiped for about 10 or 15 minutes and eventually caught my first match. His name was Kevin, and he had a nice smile that immediately caught my attention. We chatted for a day or two, and then he soon asked me to meet in person. We decided to meet for a drink at a local bar. The day of the date arrived, and I spent some time getting ready. I wore my favorite dress and did my hair and makeup to perfection. When I arrived at the bar, I saw Kevin standing outside waiting for me. He looked different from his pictures, but it wasn't that bad. He was shorter than I expected and had a nerdy look to him. Nonetheless, I pushed my doubts aside and greeted him with a smile. Everyone lies a little on their profile. I didn't feel like he catfished me or anything. We sat down at a table and ordered drinks. At first, the conversation flowed easily, and we talked about our interests and hobbies. Actually, I was doing most of the talking, and I was really carrying the conversation. I was pretty sure right away that I wouldn't be seeing him again, but I didn't want to be rude, so I stayed. However, as time passed, I started to feel like he was a bit awkward. He kept fidgeting with his hands and avoiding eye contact. It made me feel uncomfortable. I tried to brush it off and continue the conversation, though. I decided to call it a night after a single drink. I was relieved to say goodbye and head home. My place was a short walk away, maybe 10 minutes or less. I walked up the steps of my building, and when I was about to open my front door, I looked down the street and saw Kevin standing there on the sidewalk looking at me. He'd followed me home. The worst part was that he knew where I lived. If I had seen him any sooner, I could have avoided letting him see which building was mine, but it was too late. I hesitated for a few seconds, and then scurried into the lobby of my building. When I got in, I looked at my messages on Tinder. I decided not to unmatch or block him, because I wanted to save any communication between us, in case I needed to call the police. There were no new messages from him yet, though. I went to sleep trying to tell myself that it was just a coincidence. I even tried to convince myself that it wasn't really him, and that it was all in my head, but I knew that wasn't true. Also, he had told me what part of town he lived in. It was in the opposite direction, so deep down, I knew he followed me. The following days were filled with paranoia and anxiety. I kept checking my phone to see if he had messaged me, but he hadn't. I was relieved, but at the same time, I couldn't help but worry that I had a stalker. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a knock on the door. I walked towards the door, and I could see a figure standing on the other side. It was him. I still don't know how he knew which apartment was mine, but my guess is that he had been following me and spying on me. Maybe he saw me through the window or something. I obviously didn't open the door. I just told him to go away. He tried to play it off like it was no big deal, but he didn't leave. He had a sheepish look on his face and tried to apologize. I was beyond creeped out, though. I threatened to call the police, and he left after I did that. I called my brother that night and went over to his place and slept on the couch. I wish that was the end of it, but it wasn't. When I finally got back to my place, things were normal for a while, but I started to run into Kevin on the street way too often. I even started to see him at the gym, even though the one I go to is nowhere near where he said he lived. I did call the police, but there wasn't anything they could do. After a month of this, I decided to move. I got a new place in a different neighborhood, and fortunately, I haven't seen him since. I still feel paranoid sometimes, but I'm pretty sure it's over. The event I'm about to tell you is true, and it really changed my view on online dating and hookups, but here's a little backstory. I'm a 22-year-old female truck driver. I'm also a lesbian. I like my clothes a little baggy, and my hair high and tight. I've been through all sorts of crazy situations in my short lifespan. I've had to pull knives on people to protect myself, and break up fights with fully grown men. I've seen the works. This happened when I was about 18 years old, and I found myself being curious about my sexuality, and wondering how being with a guy would be. I had only been with women up until this point, and I was very single, and very curious, if you know what I mean. To quell my curiosity, I went to the internet and downloaded an app called Meet Me, in search of someone who I might be interested in. There were many creeps, and too many unnecessary pictures, until I came across a guy. Let's call him Mike. Me and Mike got to chatting, and he was really cool, chill, and very out there. After a couple of days of talking and getting to know each other, he asked me if we could meet, and of course I said yes. But now that I look back on it, I wish I had never downloaded that app. We arranged to meet at his place to hang out, eat, and play video games. Just have a chill night. I know what you're thinking. What are you doing? Are you dumb? That's how people get kidnapped in movies. You don't know this guy, and you should have met in public. But I was young and curious, so I put all my chips on the table. It was night. I went to his house and it was nice. We talked for a bit, ate some pizza, and after all that, things got pretty heated, and we did the dirty. After everything was said and done, we were laying there enjoying each other's company, and I heard a scream. I jumped and said, "Mike, I thought you were home alone. What's going on?" He said, "I am. My brother might have come home and put on a movie. Don't worry, I'll go check it out." I was sitting in his room half naked, trying to get my stuff together just in case something happened, and he came back up. Then Mike came back and said, "What are you doing? Why are you getting your stuff? I thought we were having a good time." I had a dumbfounded look on my face. I thought that scream was way too real and too close to be just the TV, so I told him, "Oh, I got a text from my dad. I have to get going. He's wondering where I am," and I told him I was on my way back. "Oh, okay, let me walk you out," he said. He walked me out, and I told him good night. You're probably wondering why I didn't call the police. Well, I never had to until 2 days later. I saw on the news that good old Mike and his brother had kidnapped, beaten, and starved their stepfather for 2 weeks. They let him go for a doctor's appointment, and he went straight to the police. That was when they caught them. I started crying right then. That could have been me with that old man. Mike could have drugged me and tied me up. It could have been a lot worse if I had stayed. So Mike, I hope you're enjoying jail, and I hope you stay there for a long time. I was a regular user of dating apps when I was younger. Thankfully, I don't use them anymore. I actually did eventually end up meeting my wife on OkCupid, but this is about a bad experience I had with someone from Tinder. It was about 5 years ago, and I was hoping to find love, or at least some kind of meaningful connection. One fateful night, as I swiped through profiles on Tinder, I got a new match. Her name was Emily, and her profile was really interesting. She went to the trouble of actually filling it out, something that I appreciated. Her pictures were also great, but not unbelievable like some of them out there. A lot of them seem fake. I'm sure it's even worse now, but back then it was bad too. I made the first move, and we exchanged a few messages, and quickly hit it off. Emily seemed intelligent, funny, and shared many of my interests. It wasn't long before we decided to meet up in person. She suggested a dive bar in our city that was on the other side of town from me, and I agreed. The day arrived, and I went to the bar, feeling a little nervous. She was blonde with green eyes. I scanned the room trying to spot her among the 5 or 10 people in the place. As I turned my head, there she was, standing at the entrance behind me. She looked just like her pictures. I approached her with a smile, and she smiled back. Then we got a table and some drinks. The conversation flowed easily, and the connection between us felt genuine. It was like we'd known each other for a long time. I was pretty thrilled that it was going so well. Time slipped away as we laughed, talked, and shared stories. After about an hour, Emily suggested continuing our date at her place. I was taken aback. I've never been the type to do that kind of thing on a first date, but I couldn't pass it up, so I accepted. We left the bar and started walking down the sidewalk. She told me her place was only a 10-minute walk. When we arrived at the apartment, I couldn't help but notice how eerily quiet the building was. It was an older building, probably built in the 70s. The hallways were musty, and it seemed that over half the lights were burnt out. There were stains on the walls, and the carpet on the floor was heavily worn down the center of the hallway. There were several large holes in the carpet as well. It was unsettling, but I couldn't blame Emily for that. It's tough to make rent in the city, and a lot of buildings are substandard. To be honest, mine wasn't much better at the time. I followed her inside, hoping it was nothing. When we entered the apartment, a subtle odor lingered in the air, a scent I couldn't quite place. It was different from the smell in the hall. I figured she had pets. Maybe it was a cat's litter box that needed to be emptied. I was put off by the smell, but it wasn't bad enough that I had to leave. Emily and I sat on the couch in her living room. We opened a bottle of wine and continued talking. Nothing much happened between us right away, but after around half an hour, the door opened. I thought it was a roommate or something. She hadn't even told me if she lived alone. Seconds later, a large man stood in front of the two of us, and he looked angry. He was around my age, but he was 6'4" and had a long brown beard and a backwards baseball hat. It wouldn't take a genius to tell who he was. I knew right away that he was her boyfriend. I looked over at Emily, and she was crying. I looked back at the guy, and he was yelling at me to get the F out of there. I didn't waste any time. I got my shoes on and headed for the door. I was gone in less than 10 seconds. I speed walked down the hallway and out the building to the street, looking back every few steps. Nobody followed. I caught the bus home, still shaking from the adrenaline. I couldn't believe what happened. I figured Emily was trying to use me to get back at her boyfriend or make him jealous. She must have planned for him to walk in on us. It was a really dirty move, both for me and for him. There's no telling what that guy could have done to me. In a way, I was lucky that he let me leave. I obviously unmatched Emily and took a long break from dating apps. I really should have reported her for what she did, but I just wanted to be done with it. I never saw or heard from her again, and luckily, all of my following experiences with dating apps have been really positive. Back in early 2017, I was on a few of the big dating apps. I was focused mainly on Tinder at the time. After a series of mediocre dates, I was almost ready to throw in the towel. But then I got a pretty promising match. Her name was Lila. Her bio caught my attention as soon as I saw it, and when I swiped right, I was really hoping that we would match. From what I could tell, she seemed like a fun and interesting person. To my surprise, we actually matched. After a few initial messages, our conversation flowed effortlessly. We had more than a few things in common, and really seemed to be hitting it off. We decided to have our first date at a local park, then we could decide what to do together. When the day of our meeting arrived, I sent her a message to confirm. She answered right away and assured me that she would meet me there at 7:30. There was a big gate at the front of the park, and that was the spot where we would meet. I headed there and got to the gate, scanning the faces in the crowd, hoping to catch a glimpse of Lila. Just when I was about to message her, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was Lila, requesting that we meet at a different spot a few blocks away. It was just a street corner. I didn't know why she would want to do that. If she was a few blocks away, then why not just come and meet me? I agreed anyway and started walking. It would only take a few minutes. As I walked towards the new location, anticipation grew inside me. I wasn't worried about the sudden change of plans. I thought she had just found a good spot. However, as soon as I reached the corner where we were set to meet, another message from Lila appeared on my screen. She suggested meeting at a different place, farther away this time. Despite the inconvenience, I really wanted to meet her, so I agreed and went along with it. Upon arriving at the third location, a strange feeling hit me. It was basically an alley between two apartment buildings. There were no other people around that I could see. That place had trouble written all over it. Instinctively, I knew something wasn't quite right, but I walked around for a while anyway. I was too curious not to find out what was going on. By this point, I was pretty much 50-50 on Lila being real, but I couldn't let it go. Not smart, I know. Suddenly I noticed two men walking towards me from the other side. They were wearing dark clothes, jeans, and black hoodies. They also both wore surgical masks and sunglasses. I turned to run in the opposite direction, and then I saw another large man approaching from that way, effectively blocking me into the alley. He looked the same as the others, only bigger. I scurried around to find a way out. The only option was a door on one of the buildings. but it was locked. I shook the handle for a few seconds, and then turned around. I was surrounded. The 3 men stood in front of me, not moving. Then one of them said,
"We're Lila. I think you know what this is. Wallet and phone now."
I looked at them holding back tears. I felt so stupid. Even though I knew something was wrong, I went for it anyway. I didn't bother trying to plead with the men. I just handed them my wallet and phone. Before they walked away, one of them told me they'd kill me if I called the police. The scary thing is that I believed them. After they were gone, I cautiously walked back out to the street. It was dark by then. I looked around, scanning the street for those men. I didn't want to run into them again. When I was sure they were gone, I walked home, looking over my shoulder the whole way. When I got home, I contemplated calling the police, but that threat from one of the guys really scared me. I was also feeling embarrassed. I wanted nothing more than to put the whole thing behind me. Looking back, I know I should have reported it in order to warn others, but that's not what I did. In fact, I never told anybody about it until now. It feels really good to finally get it out. I was almost 23 when this started. Just pointing out now, I used to be a very different person. I've learned to be less stubborn. I met this man online when I was 22 years old. We'll call him Dude. Dude was 40 when we started talking. It never clicked to me back then that at his age, he shouldn't be as unique as he was. I thought he was pretty awesome at the time though. We were instantly best friends. That's at least how I felt. He listened and would tell me random stories. The way he worded things was always weird. He'd talk like we were in a live-action Dungeons & Dragons game. We messaged every day. I was in a relationship at the time, and he even made friends with my then boyfriend. Then we stopped talking for about a year. He texted me one day out of the blue and said he'd lost all his contacts except mine for some reason. He sent me a picture of my contact on his phone. It was a photo that I had sent him, but I overlooked it at the time. It was like our friendship resumed where it left off. He was now going through a divorce, and I was his supportive friend. Those were his words. He told me there were lines he didn't want to cross, and soon we began talking on the phone. Normal conversations. He started hinting at wanting me to help him tail his soon-to-be ex-wife, because she wouldn't know me. He was too curious to know who she was living with. That was red flag number 1, that I actually recognized as a red flag. Someone else told me that he was crazy and to stay away. So what did I do? I continued talking to Dude, just because I was told not to. Again, he said there were lines he didn't want to cross. Red flag number 2, his religion, Scientology. He never pressured me to join, but he'd always want me to come for moral support, for audits and such things. I always declined. Again, my friend told me to stay away, but I didn't listen. Soon, Dude wanted to hang out. I tried to decline as politely as possible, making excuses like that I was busy, but eventually I gave in. I sent him the address of where I was. I want to point out again that this man said we were friends, and there were lines that he didn't want to cross. I didn't either, but I meant it. He didn't. He pulled up to my place on his moped. I'm 5'7", and this now 42-year-old man was an entire foot shorter than me. The first thing he did was stick his tongue in my mouth. When I got out of this unwanted kiss, he looked at me, felt my face, and said,
"I just wanted to make sure you were real."
"Because me sitting on the driveway in front of you is totally not proof enough." I was super uncomfortable, but since I was at my parents' house, I was okay. He tried to get me to ride his moped with him. I declined over and over. My little sister came out. She was 17 at the time. He became friendly with her and instantly wanted to take her for a ride. She agreed, so he drove her around the neighborhood and brought her back. Then I decided it was time for him to leave. We still talked and he started to become very possessive, even though I was still in a relationship with someone else at that point. Then he started asking for my 17-year-old sister's number and talking about what he wanted to do to the both of us. I really wanted to stop talking to that guy, but by then I was too scared because I gave him my address and he knew where my little sister slept. Finally, after he blew up my phone for days, with me responding maybe every 20 texts, I finally just blocked him. Then he started texting my boyfriend and asking where I was. He was asking for my little sister's number. He said that I was going to give it to him and forgot. A total lie. With the text app I used to have, if you blocked someone, you could still see the messages. You just didn't get notifications, and they didn't show up in your normal text folder. He sent me 2 15-page texts, one in English and the other in Spanish. He continued to keep spamming mine and my now ex's phone for months. Eventually, he finally just disappeared. I'm 28 now, and luckily I still haven't heard from him. I've totally decided that red flags are red flags for a reason, and if your gut tells you to stay away, you should do it. At the time when this happened, I had been single for a while, so I decided to try online dating. After swiping through countless profiles, I came across Chase. He was tall, handsome, and looked like he could be a model. In fact, his pictures were so good that I thought he might have actually been a model. His profile said he was an engineer though, so maybe a part-time model. I was immediately intrigued and swiped right. We matched, and soon enough, we started chatting on the app. We hit it off right away. He knew all the right things to say. Chase seemed like the perfect guy, and we quickly made plans to meet up for a date. On the day of our date, I spent hours getting ready. I wanted to look my best for this guy, who seemed too good to be true. I arrived at the bar that we agreed on, and scanned the crowd for Chase. After a few minutes, I saw a guy waving at me from across the room. He didn't look anything like Chase, but I waved back anyway. I made my way over to him, and he introduced himself as Chase. I was shocked. He looked nothing like the pictures. In his profile, he used pictures that were genuinely not him at all. This wasn't a few filters and some good lighting. This was an entirely different person. I figured the pictures must have come from an actual model. I felt stupid for falling for it. I should have known it was too good to be true. I didn't want to be rude though, so I sat down and tried to make conversation. It was clear that there was no chemistry between us, and the date was awkward from the start. He seemed to be trying too hard to impress me, and I found myself cringing at his jokes and stories. I was also upset about being misled. There was a tension between us because we both knew what he had done, and neither of us was talking about it. After half an hour, I knew I had to end the date. I thanked him for his time and told him that I had to leave. That's when things took a turn for the worse. Chase threw a fit in the bar. I left, but he followed me. He started berating me for rejecting him and accused me of wasting his time and being shallow, among other insults. I was taken aback by his reaction and felt scared as he followed me down the street. He was acting like I was the one who wronged him, when he actually catfished me. It was the ultimate gaslighting. I tried to ignore him and walk away, but he kept yelling at me. He was becoming more and more aggressive, and I started to worry about my safety. I was about to call the police when a patrol car drove by. Chase saw the car and ran away. It was just in time, because I was about to flag the cop down. I was shaken up by the whole experience, and decided to delete my Tinder profile. I couldn't believe that someone I had never met before could be so volatile and threatening. He completely tricked me and got mad at me for pretending it was not all good. That guy had a twisted mind to think like that. The creepiest thing is that I downloaded Tinder again 6 months later. I kept seeing that same profile coming up with the model pictures. He was still at it, tricking women, and probably treating them the same way he treated me. He didn't even bother to change the pictures. When I saw that, I reported him to Tinder. They took down the profile, but who knows how many others he has. Whenever I meet someone now, I always ask for a selfie before we meet. That way I can at least make sure that I'm meeting the person in the pictures. doesn't necessarily mean he won't be a creep, but it's something. This is something that happened to me a few years ago when I was a college student. I was in my 3rd year, and I was living in a small apartment off campus. It was on the first floor of a 3-story building. I had my own room, and a flatmate who I didn't really get along with. We had been friends in the past, but we had a falling out. I lost most of my friends because of it. It was a pretty awkward situation, and it was a difficult time of my life. I was really lonely. One day, I decided to try out Tinder, hoping to meet new people, or maybe even find a boyfriend. But I would have been open to just making friends. I swiped through a few profiles before matching with a guy named Ryan. He seemed nice enough in his profile. He actually did a decent job of filling it out. Most people don't even bother. He sent the first message, and we started chatting. He asked me out on a date, and I agreed. I thought it couldn't hurt to give him a chance. For our first date, we agreed to meet at a coffee shop near campus. We talked for a while, but there wasn't really anything between us. I could tell he was interested in me, but I didn't feel the same way. After the date, I politely told him that I didn't think that we were a good match. A lot of people would just ghost, but I think it's fair enough to be upfront. He seemed disappointed but didn't make a scene or anything. We were in a public place, so maybe that's why he behaved himself. Right when we were about to part ways, I saw a look in his eyes. It didn't alarm me at the time, but now that I look back, it was really unsettling. At first, everything seemed fine. I didn't hear from Ryan for a few days, and I thought that was the end of it. But then I started seeing him around campus more and more often. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but then I noticed that he seemed to be following me. I tried to ignore it and hoped he would eventually get the message and leave me alone. But then one day, I was alone at home doing some homework. I was sitting at my desk, which was right next to my window. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something through the window. I walked over to it and looked out. It was Ryan. He was spying on me in my room. I was horrified and immediately called the police. They came and talked to him, but there wasn't much they could do. Ryan denied that he was looking in my window and said he was just passing by. My window was just off a busy street, so it was somewhat believable to them. I knew the truth, though. After that happened, I was always looking over my shoulder. I felt like I was being watched all the time, even when I was in my apartment. I started to dread leaving the building. I was always worried Ryan would be waiting for me outside. One day I was on my way to class, and I saw him following me again. I tried to lose him in the crowd, but he kept getting closer and closer. Finally, I turned and confronted him. "What do you want from me?" I demanded.
I just want to talk to you,
He said. "I don't want to talk to you," I said firmly. "Please leave me alone." He didn't say anything, but I could tell he wasn't going to give up that easily. I knew I had to do something to protect myself. I started carrying pepper spray with me everywhere I went, and I also took a self-defense class. But even with all those precautions, I still felt vulnerable. I didn't know how to make him stop, and I was afraid that things would only get worse. I confided in my mom and sister about the ordeal. They were in a different city, though. Finally, after weeks of feeling like I was being stalked, I decided to confront Ryan again. This time I was more forceful, telling him that I was going to call the police if he didn't leave me alone. To my surprise, he finally backed off. I didn't know what made him realize that he was wrong, but I was grateful for the peace of mind. I was able to go back to my normal routine without constantly looking over my shoulder. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was to get away without any harm coming to me. I know there are many people out there who aren't so lucky. But even though it's been years since this scary period of my life, I still can't forget the feeling of vulnerability that came from the incident. I'm a 28-year-old guy, and this happened when I was 27. I had been using Tinder for a few months with no success. I had swiped left and right on countless profiles, and no one seemed interested. That is until I got a match with Sheila. Her profile picture was a bit blurry, but I could tell that she was really beautiful. She had long blonde hair and green eyes. Her bio said she loved hiking, reading, and trying new restaurants. A pretty basic description, but I didn't have a lot of options. I was happy to get a match at all. We started chatting on the app, and I was surprised by how well we clicked. Our conversation flowed easily, and we had a lot in common. After a few days of talking, I asked if she wanted to meet up. She agreed, and sent me a location where we could meet. I didn't think much of it, and I didn't even bother looking up the address beforehand. On the day of the date, I got in my car and followed my GPS to the location. As I drove, I eventually found myself out in the country. I was surrounded by wheat fields. There were not any bars or restaurants, so I was confused. I had expected to meet in the city, where there would be other people around. Instead, I found myself in a desolate area with no signs of life. The trees towered over me, and I felt scared. I tried to shrug off the feeling and kept driving until I reached the address. I pulled up to an old abandoned-looking house with boarded-up windows and a rusty fence surrounding it. My heart sank. I immediately knew something wasn't right. I started to panic and decided to turn back. I didn't know if Sheila was real or not, but I couldn't risk it. That house looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. As I made my way back to the city, I noticed a car following me. It was tailgating me and honking its horn aggressively. I tried to speed up, but the car stayed right behind me. It even bumped the back of my car at one point, causing me to swerve a little bit. I was so confused, but I kept driving. I was hoping the car would eventually turn around and give up. As soon as I reached the city limits, the car did turn around and sped off in the opposite direction. I let out a sigh of relief and pulled over to the side of the road. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding. I was careful to make sure I wasn't being followed, so I didn't drive home right away. I circled the city for about half an hour, and then I pulled into a gas station parking lot. I pulled out my phone to text Sheila, but I noticed her profile was no longer on Tinder. It had been deleted. Not entirely surprising, but in the commotion, I wasn't thinking straight. At that point, I still kinda thought she was real, but she wasn't. I realized I'd been set up. The whole thing was a trap. My mind raced with questions. Who was Sheila, and why did she want me to meet her in the middle of nowhere? Who was in that car that followed me, and what did they want? I knew I had dodged a bullet, and I felt grateful to be alive, but at the same time, I felt disappointed and used. It was a real blow to my self-esteem. The only match I got on Tinder turned out to be some psycho who tried to run me off the road. They probably would have done much worse to me if I'd gone into that house. I swore off Tinder after that incident. I couldn't trust anyone on the app anymore, and I didn't want to put myself in harm's way again. When I was 24, I downloaded Tinder for the first time. I wish it was the last time, but it wasn't. I got a lot of matches right away. One of them was Darren. Darren was charming and witty in his messages, and we quickly hit it off. He was a tall, muscular guy with short hair and a smile that could light up a room. We decided to meet up for drinks at a local bar in the city. When I arrived, I was a little nervous, but Darren put me at ease with his friendly demeanor. We ordered drinks and talked about our interests, our families, and our experiences on Tinder. Everything was going all right until we left the bar and started walking down the street. Out of nowhere, a man appeared and demanded our wallets and phones. He had a knife, and I froze in terror. But Darren didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of me and faced the mugger, his fists raised in a defensive position. The mugger lunged forward with his knife, but Darren was quick to dodge and counterattack. He threw the man to the ground. The mugger scrambled to get back up, and then he ran away with his tail between his legs. I suggested that we call the police, but Darren said it was no big deal. I insisted. I saw the man's face clearly. He was probably in his late 20s with a patchy beard and an old baseball hat. Darren was firm though. He refused to get the police involved. I eventually let the issue go. It was a terrifying experience, but Darren stepped up. I felt grateful and impressed by his actions, but I didn't really feel any romantic chemistry between us. I didn't say anything at the time though. He walked me home, close to my home, but I said goodbye a block or two away from my building, just to be safe. I could tell Darren was fishing for an invite into my place. He clearly wanted some action, but I wasn't into it. I didn't hear from Darren for a few days after that night, and I assumed he had moved on. But one day, I received a message from him asking me out again. I politely declined, explaining that I didn't feel a romantic connection, and I thought that would be the end of it. But Darren didn't take my rejection well. He started sending me angry and threatening texts. It was really horrible stuff, but I'm not going to get into specifics. I tried to reason with him, telling him that I had been honest, but he wouldn't listen. It was like he felt entitled. I thought that maybe since he protected me from that mugger, he thought I owed him something. I felt scared and uncomfortable, wondering if he was watching me or following me. I tried to ignore his messages, but they kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last. After a few scary days, the messages and calls stopped. It seemed like he'd moved on. I didn't know what that guy's problem was. He was 28 years old. I would have thought he'd learned how to deal with rejection by then. Whatever the case may be, I was glad it was over. The story doesn't end there, though. It was about a month later, and I hadn't heard from Darren. I was walking down the street on Saturday afternoon, and I saw Darren walking towards me on the sidewalk, and he was with another guy. They didn't see me, so I quickly slipped behind a building to hide. When they passed, I saw something that shocked me. The other guy with Darren was the mugger from our date. I was confused for a split second, and then I realized the truth. The mugger was a friend of his. He put him up to it so he could act like a hero. That's why he wouldn't call the cops. I watched nervously as they walked down the sidewalk. I was really hoping that they wouldn't turn around. I still wonder what he would have done if we ended up dating. He would have had to ditch that friend of his. Otherwise, I would have known what he did. I guess he didn't think it would get that far anyway. That guy had really bad intentions, and I'm glad my intuition kicked in when it did. This happened to me last year. When I first started posting on Instagram, I didn't think much would come of it, although I hoped it would. I mean, sure, I posted a lot of pictures of myself and my life, but I never expected to attract such a big audience. At first I was a little overwhelmed by all the attention, but then I started to enjoy it. Every day I would wake up to dozens of new likes and comments on my photos. People from all over the world were following me and commenting on my pictures, telling me how beautiful I was and how much they loved my style. It was like having a fan club, and it felt amazing. But then one day, I noticed a new follower who looked a little off. His name was Smith999, and his profile picture was just a stock image of a lion. He had no posts, no bio, and no followers, but he was commenting on all my photos with generic comments like gorgeous and love your outfit. At first I didn't think much of it. I figured he was just another fan who was a little shy, or maybe a bot. I heard there were a lot of those out there. But eventually things started to get weird. Around that same time, I started to notice a strange car circling my neighborhood. I lived in a quiet neighborhood, and it was rare for me to see a car that I didn't recognize. I had an apartment on the second floor of an old historic building. It was only 4 floors in total. My window, although it was on the second floor, was actually pretty low to the ground. The first floor was partially below ground level. When I noticed the car, I started to hear noises outside my window in the middle of the night. I peeked out and saw a dark figure walking around outside. My window overlooked a private courtyard for my building. It was not a public street or anything, so it was really strange to see someone out there, especially at night. This went on for a while. I had trouble sleeping and resorted to taking sleeping pills. Looking back, I wouldn't recommend them, unless it was an absolute last resort. When I took those pills, I was knocked out so hard that I'm not sure that the fire alarm would have even woken me. It was actually pretty scary what they did to me. One day, I was scrolling through Instagram as I often did, and I came across that strange profile that I mentioned before. I clicked on it for no real reason, and when I did, I got really scared. All of his pictures were of my apartment. Some were the outside area surrounding my building, and some were the general area of my neighborhood. Most disturbing of all, though, some of them were of my bedroom, taken from my window. I could even see myself sleeping. Smith 999 must have been that strange guy walking around at night. I immediately blocked him and reported his profile to Instagram. Then I walked over to my curtains and yanked them closed, almost ripping them off the wall. But things only got worse from there. I started to receive strange messages from anonymous accounts. It was just ominous single-line messages like "Hey beautiful" and "Miss you." That was when I called the police. They took my concerns seriously and assured me they would investigate. They also suggested that I stay with a friend in the meantime. I moved back in with my parents temporarily, leaving my apartment empty. It was a shame because I really loved my apartment, but I couldn't stay there, especially not alone. It was just over 2 weeks before I heard back from the police. They found the guy. Somehow, they were able to trace the account that had posted all those pictures. The man was arrested, and the police assured me that it was safe to return to my apartment. I was relieved, and although I loved my parents, I was ready to go and live on my own again. I really missed having my own space, so I packed up my stuff and headed back to my place. I walked up the stairs of my building and unlocked my front door. As soon as I did, I knew something was wrong. It was just a feeling at first, but when I walked into my bedroom, I almost fainted from shock. There were words written all over my bedroom in black marker. Things like "Hey beautiful" and "Hot pic." The types of things that my followers would comment on my pictures. That freak broke into my apartment while I was away. I still don't know how he got in. Whether he picked the lock or got in through the window somehow, I have no idea. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it all the time. I moved shortly after that incident, and haven't had any problems since. I still post pictures, even though this was the scariest thing I've ever experienced. What can I say? I'm addicted. I never thought I'd fall for something like this. I've always considered myself a really savvy and cautious person, but I guess love or lust can just blind you to all the red flags. It all started with a direct message from a beautiful girl on Instagram. Her profile was private, but she had a few pictures that showed a stunning figure and a seductive smile. I have a decent following on Instagram myself, so it's not unusual for me to get random DMs. I won't get too specific about who I am, but I'm a musician with a strong social media presence. We started chatting, and I was surprised by how friendly and flirty she was. She complimented me on my looks and my sense of humor, and she asked me about my interests and my work. We talked for a few hours, and then we exchanged phone numbers. She sent me some selfies, and I couldn't help but feel excited by the prospect of meeting her in person. She said she lived in a high-rise condo downtown, and invited me to come over for a drink. I hesitated at first, but she insisted that she was a trustworthy person, something that only a trustworthy person would say. I knew it was probably not smart, but I agreed. I couldn't resist. I took a shower, put on my best shirt, and took an Uber over to her place. I was nervous and excited, wondering if she would be as hot and charming as she seemed online. When I arrived, I was impressed by the building's sleek and modern design. I took the elevator up to the 20th floor. I walked up to the door, almost shaking from the nerves. I knocked twice, then within seconds the door swung open. I was mesmerized. She was even more beautiful than her pictures. She greeted me with a warm hug, and I could smell her perfume. She led me to the living room, where she had prepared a cozy setup with candles, a bottle of wine, and some appetizers. We sat on the couch, she poured us some drinks, and we clinked glasses. We talked about our lives, our passions, and our dreams. She told me she was a model and an influencer. I hesitated when she said that, because her Instagram only had a handful of followers. Maybe she was big on another platform, but I doubted it. I brushed off my concerns, though. Eventually, I needed to go to the bathroom, so I excused myself and walked down the hallway, trying to remember where she had pointed me. I found it and entered, closing the door behind me. I did my business and washed my hands, then I looked at myself in the mirror. That's when I heard a noise. It was footsteps coming from the living room, but not just one set of footsteps. There were many. I walked out of the bathroom and back down the hall. When I got back, I saw 4 men standing in the living room, blocking the door. My date was nowhere to be seen. The men were wearing black clothes, black gloves, and black masks. One of them was holding a gun. "What's going on?" I said.
Shut up and do what we say.
One of them said in a deep and menacing voice. They told me to take out my phone and to sign into my crypto account. That's when I realized that it was a trap. I knew these guys targeted me because of who I am. Like I said before, I have a decent following on social media, and I've promoted several crypto projects. They must have known that I would have something to steal. I had no choice but to do what they said. I signed into my account, trembling and sweating, knowing I was just about to lose everything. They gave me an address and told me to transfer all my crypto to it. I did what they said, feeling sick and stupid, knowing I'd fallen for a classic scam. As soon as the transfer was confirmed, one of the guys grabbed my phone out of my hand and told me to take off. I left feeling used and stupid. I didn't know the area, and I had no way to call an Uber, the police, or anyone to pick me up. I just wanted to crawl into a hole and hide from the world. I don't even want to say how much money I lost that night. It was bad. I walked down the street for several minutes before I was able to flag down a police car. I told him what happened, and he gave me a ride to the station. I told my story, including the address of the condo. A few days later, I heard back from the police. It turned out that the condo was actually an Airbnb, and it was rented by a fake account linked to a stolen credit card. I don't understand exactly how they pulled that off, but I figured it was something like that. This was a real wake-up call for me. Being young, it's easy to feel invincible, like there's nothing bad that can really happen. It took a terrible experience like this for me to realize that there are people out there who will hurt and take advantage of you. I never got my money back, and I'd be lying if I said I was over it. Back when I was in college, not that long ago actually, I had a really vibrant social life. I was considered a conventionally attractive girl, and I loved spending time with my friends, studying, and keeping up with the latest trends on Instagram. One day, I received a follower request from a former classmate of mine. I didn't think much of it. I vaguely remembered him from a couple of classes that we'd had, but we never really talked. His name was Eric, and he always gave me a bad feeling. He was my age, and I was 21 at the time. He was tall and thin, and always wore black. When I checked out his profile on Instagram, it was something else entirely. All of his pictures were of him in a dark room, looking really sad and scary. It's like he was trying to be a goth or something. I didn't know what to make of it, but I didn't want to be rude, so I accepted his request. Almost immediately, he started sending me messages about how beautiful I was, and how much he admired me from afar. I was really shocked by that, because we used to see each other all the time at school, but he never said anything back then. I figured he was just shy, which is actually understandable. I didn't know how to respond to his messages. They made me uncomfortable, and I didn't want to encourage him. I ignored them for a while, but they didn't stop. In fact, they got even worse. He would send at least a few messages every day, most of them asking why I wasn't answering. So I did what any sane person would do. I blocked him. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. Every day when I went to school, I was concerned I would run into Eric, but for some reason, I never saw him there at all. We were in the same program, so I was really curious why I didn't see him at class. Don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining. I didn't want to see him. It was just weird. One night I was in my room, scrolling through Instagram, when I heard a noise coming from outside. At first I thought it was just one of my roommates coming home. I heard footsteps outside my bedroom, and for some reason, I knew it wasn't either of my roommates. I would have recognized the sound of their steps. This was someone else. I knew I had to call the police, but I didn't want to make any noise. I didn't want whoever was out there to know where I was. I quickly grabbed my phone and tiptoed into my closet. I quietly shut the door behind me. I could hear my heart pounding. I was focusing on my breath, trying to keep as quiet as possible. The footsteps were still outside my room, so I took out my phone and dialed 911. I whispered to the dispatcher what was happening, and they told me to stay on the line and stay hidden. I stayed there for what felt like a really long time, listening to the sounds of someone moving around in my apartment. Then I heard my bedroom door open. Whoever it was had entered my room. It was just the closet door separating us now. I could hear them opening drawers and shuffling things around. I didn't know what they were looking for, and I didn't even care. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. The police were close. The sirens got louder, and then I heard the sound of someone running away. It was probably safe to come out, but I didn't dare to move. When I finally emerged from the closet, I saw that my room had been ransacked. My clothes were strewn everywhere, and my bed was flipped over. It was like a tornado had swept through my room. I was surprised because it didn't sound like that much damage had been done. I was panicking though, so maybe I was not thinking straight. The police greeted me at the front door. They had possibly saved my life, and I was very grateful. Then I looked out the window. There was another officer who had someone in handcuffs. It was Eric. I suspected it, but now I was sure. I could hardly believe that guy broke into my place. I felt sick to my stomach. I'd always thought he was creepy, but I never imagined he would do something like this. The police told me to be careful, and to call them if anything else happened. I went home for a few days to stay with my parents. I couldn't bear the thought of staying at that place after what had just happened. When I came back to school, I found out that Eric had been kicked out of school months earlier for stalking another girl. He technically didn't break any laws in that case, not that they could prove anyway. So he was free to do what he did to me. Fortunately, we got him off the streets, so he can't hurt anyone else. I'd always wanted to be a model since I was really young. Growing up, I was always told that I was pretty and had the perfect body for it. I had long legs and a slim figure, and I knew I would look good on camera. So I started posting pictures of myself on Instagram, hoping that someone would notice me. I'd grown a following of a few thousand, posting mostly selfies that were admittedly not very professional. I wasn't taking it seriously, but I was hoping that something would come of it. I received a message from a talent agency. They said they'd seen my pictures and were interested in meeting me. I was over the moon with excitement. I checked out their profile, and it seemed legit. They were a well-established agency, with a real website and everything. They gave me the address to their office, and told me to come in for a meeting. I imagined the office would be in a big building. However, when I arrived there, I was surprised to find that it was just an apartment complex. I stood there staring at the building for a moment, wondering if I'd made a mistake. I sent a message to the agent, letting them know I was there. They replied almost instantly and told me to go in. I hesitated for a second, but then I thought about what it could do for my career. I put aside my worries and entered the building. As I walked into the building, I felt nervous. The lobby was clean and well lit, but it was eerily quiet. There was no receptionist, no sign of anyone else in the building. I made my way to the elevator and pressed the button for the floor that the agency was on. When I arrived at the floor, I stepped out of the elevator and looked both ways. It was just like any other apartment hallway. Definitely wasn't an office building. I timidly walked to number 56, which was the unit that they gave me. It was a plain white door just like all the others in the hall. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. After a moment, I heard a voice from inside the room telling me to come in. I pushed the door open, and I was greeted by a large man. He was wearing a suit and had a friendly smile on his face.
Hello, we spoke through Instagram. Please come in and take a seat,
he said. I took a few cautious steps inside and looked around the room. I saw that it was just an apartment. There was no desk or anything. It was literally just a guy's apartment. I was about to get out of there. The vibe was way off. I took a step back and thanked the man for his time. Then I told him that I needed to leave. He looked surprised. As I walked towards the door, he walked over and held it closed.
Is something wrong?
He asked, a strange glint in his eyes. I was pretty much in panic mode at that point. The friendly smile was gone, and he seemed more menacing than before. I tried to open the door, but he grabbed my arm, and I felt his grip tighten.
It's all good. Just take a seat,
he said. His voice was low and threatening. I tried to pull away, but his grip was way too strong. I looked around the room, hoping to find something I could use to defend myself, but there was nothing, certainly not that I could reach. That was when I heard a set of footsteps outside in the hallway. I figured it must be one of the neighbors. I took the opportunity and let out my loudest and highest scream. When I did that, the man released my arm. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I sprinted down the hallway, not stopping until I reached the elevator. I ran past an older man when I was in the hallway. He must have been the neighbor that I heard. I hit the button repeatedly, praying it would come quickly. When the doors finally opened, I went inside and hit the button for the lobby. As the elevator descended, I burst out crying. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I'd come here with so much hope, only to be met with danger. When I reached the lobby, I ran out of the building onto the street, and I didn't stop until I was far away, in a crowded area where I felt safe. I sat down on a bench and caught my breath. I realized how naive I had been. I'd been so desperate for this opportunity that I hadn't stopped to think about the dangers. I put myself in harm's way, and I was lucky to have gotten away. I did eventually call the police. It turned out that Instagram page was fake. The talent agency was real, but the guy had nothing to do with them. The man was arrested, and I later found out that he was being investigated for doing similar things to other women. I never found out what happened to them, but I hope they were as lucky as me.